Today is September 25th, 2012. This is Forensic Interviewing of Children. And your assignments for today included reading Professor Fowler's text, Chapter 10 and Chapter 13, as well as a number of different articles about child development. And there are two sections on child development, I believe. And this one focuses on general child development, and I think the next one we focus a little bit more on children's linguistic development. However, there are a couple of articles here that speak to that issue as well, and that is the issue of how kids acquire language, how they learn to express themselves, which is really a fascinating process. And it's important for forensic interviewers. In fact, the things that we talk about today, the things that I mention, and the readings that are there for you to consume, will help you do Discussion Board 1. Because we just talked about Discussion Board 1 and going over the website and the Blackboard site. Well, that asks you to take a look at the idea that forensic interviewers need to know things about child development. And it says, discuss why knowing things about child development is important for a forensic interviewer. That's really what Discussion Board 1 is. Okay? And that's what the chatter ought to be about Thursday and Sunday. So we started with Chapter 10 in Professor Fowler's book, and the name of that chapter is Special Considerations for Cases Involving Young Children. And the reason why that's a good chapter for you to think about in this section is because child development is most germane, most important with the smallest children. Certainly kids that develop more, certainly kids that are older, present less problems for a forensic interviewer. A 9-year-old is going to be less challenging than a 4-year-old. That doesn't mean a 9-year-old is fully developed. That doesn't mean a 9-year-old thinks any way near the way adults think, but much closer to the way adults think than preschoolers. So Chapter 10 is a good place to start because this is the early development of children, and it's at this early stage of their maturity, their developing maturity, that they present the most challenges. And Professor Fowler, who authored this chapter along with Sandra Hewitt, who's from Minnesota, and another social worker who is very experienced and also has expertise with young children. In fact, Sandra Hewitt wrote another book called Assessing Preschoolers for Sexual Abuse. I used to use her book in some context a few years back. So Hewitt knows what she's talking about, and so does Professor Fowler. And they start out by saying, who is a young child? I mean, what do we mean when we say young children present bigger problems than older children and they are more challenging? Well, one place they suggest to look is the research. We need to learn how kids grow, how they think, how they express themselves, how they view the world around them. And if that's our goal, the thing that informs us best is research in this area. So what does the research consider little kids or a young child, as this chapter poses the question? Well, Fowler and Hewitt say, research has documented distinct differences between 3 and 4-year-olds and 5 and 6-year-olds in their capacity. So sometimes we are inclined to call this age group preschoolers, right? But if you call them preschoolers, and preschoolers can go up to almost the 5th year, still be in preschool, right? If you simply lump all those kids together, you're asking for trouble. Because if you have children of your own, or you do this for a while, you think about 3 and 4-year-olds and 4 and 5-year-olds, there are very meaningful differences between their to their competence, how able they are to do things, and their development. And that's what Fowler and you would say here. 3 and 4-year-olds have distinct differences between 5 and 6-year-olds in their intellectual and social capacities. As kids become older, even by weeks and months, their capabilities improve. Their understanding of events, recall of experiences, and their ability to resist suggestion can develop and change in a matter of weeks or months. So you might have a child who's 5, who's more vulnerable to suggestion, who has a harder time understanding adult language and communicating, and then within a month, there's that process where they grow more, where they're able to comprehend better. So there's a lot of movement here. It's a very dynamic time in childhood. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all kinds of things are going on, all kinds of developments going on, and sometimes it's even a matter of weeks between an inability to do something and then an ability to do something. The maturation process is on turbo drive at this point. Having said that, we're talking generally about children. There's a lot of variability if you simply look at chronological age. Variability means if you look at 2 5-year-olds and 122 days, one 5-year-old with 122 days is going to be more capable than another 5-year-old at 5 years and 122 days. And that doesn't mean that the one who's not as capable won't catch up or maybe even pass the other 5-year-old who's exactly the same age. Chronological age alone is not a dispositive or absolute predictor of ability. And of course, there's just some kids are smarter than others. It's the way it is. Some kids are more social than others. Some kids have more language than others. And there's going to be that kind of variability just based upon, their natural abilities. And sometimes some kids develop a little later than other kids, and they'll catch up and maybe even pass. And sometimes when they're both fully developed, some people are just more able than other people. So in thinking about child development and thinking about the person who sits across from us in the interview room, we need to think about how kids grow, how they develop, how they think, how they view the world around them, how they acquire words and language and the ability to express themselves. And we start with the littlest, the most challenging. And, the good news is they can be very able. They can be very capable. They certainly remember stuff. What's difficult is expressing that in a way that makes sense to adults. That's the challenge. The memory's there, facilitating it, getting it out in a way that makes sense to us adults is the challenge. And the biggest challenge is the very young kids, and that's the class or group that we're talking about right now. And like I said, even among that group, weeks or months can make a big difference. Some kids are exactly the same age and not as good as the next kid at exactly that same age. So you have to say to yourself, as discussion board 1 poses the question, who cares? Or why is this important? Why does Del Russo emphasize this? So what? How's that going to help me when I sit down across from a kid? Well, it will, and you'll tell me why. Tell each other why. I'll give you a little hint. If you know what a child is capable of, generally speaking, right, you can speak to that child in a way that makes sense to them and does not ask for information or ask for that child to interact with you in a way that's beyond their capabilities. Now, if you ask a 6-year-old for the Pythagorean theorem, you start waving your finger because they don't know it, to use a silly example, I guess, you're speaking about advanced calculus. They haven't gotten there yet, right? That's a silly way to emphasize the point. But that's well beyond their competence, okay? Well beyond geometry, calculus, perhaps beyond our competence. But the point is, the more we know about the capability of the person across from us, the better interviewer we will be. Okay? When we ask things that the child can't answer, or we engage in a discussion or speak to ideas that are beyond the child's competence, number one, we're doing a disservice to the child because they struggle with trying to communicate with us and answer that question or respond to whatever we're trying to do. You're being inefficient because there are certain things they can do, but they're not doing because we asked the question that's age and developmentally inappropriate. So we're wasting time. That's what inefficiency means. We're asking stuff that's beyond their understanding. And in doing so, we may confuse them because they may want to try to please us and then respond in a way that's non-responsive. And then we impugn or hurt their credibility or believability because we ask a developmentally inappropriate question. If we ask something that's beyond their abilities and they come back at us with an attempt to please us or answer the question rather than simply say, as most kids won't do, I don't know what you're talking about. That's beyond my understanding. I'm only 4 or I'm only 5. Not most kids. No kids will do that. So they'll either look at you with a blank stare or, most dangerously and unfortunately, most often, try to answer you. And then when they do answer us and their answer is non-responsive or it feels responsive, it happened in the bushes. If we accept what they say and it's just an attempt to try to answer something that's beyond their years and we go off on a tangent to go look in the bushes when that's not what they meant at all or they were confused, we not only have inefficiency, we not only have a situation where we might create confusion, but we might go on an investigative dead end. And if we find nothing in the bushes, we might declare that child as being deceptive or wrong. If we misinterpret what the child expresses, right? And we think we understand what they said, but it's our fault. It's always our fault. That's the way it is. We need to be good interviewers. If we speak beyond a child's ability to answer us, and we take that information, which wasn't the child answering the question, but their attempt to try to give us the information they think we want, and we go in that direction and it's a zero, we don't find what we're looking for, whatever that might be, we then come back and go, kid was wrong. He was lying. Did your dad use a condom when he put his wiener on your butt? Where did he put it? I don't know. Did he throw it in the garbage or maybe flush it down the toilet? In the garbage. We go look in the garbage. No condom. She's wrong. She's lying. Is it still there? It's not there. I hope that no one would ask that kind of question. But and often the lack of competence to answer our questions is not as distinct as the examples I'm giving you. It's a little more subtle, but we're here to learn about how kids so you can be better at it. But to drive home the point, I'm prone to overstatement, so you get what I'm saying. You understand? Obviously, condom is not a word that a child at age 4 ought to know and shouldn't know. And it is a developmentally inappropriate question of the highest order. It's overstated by me. But overstated by me to show you how you can go on a dead end, look for the condom in the garbage, and it's not there, and then go, the little girl was lying or wrong at best. When she was neither. She was just trying to answer the question. What if she engaged in auditory discrimination error? See, that's why I wanted to talk to the second graders to ask them about these words and look at the answers that you get and go, wow, that's a wacky one. This one's interesting. I wonder what the kid was thinking when they answered that way. And I said to you, tell these kids, I know you don't know, just give me your best response. Not every kid will tell you they don't know. Most of them won't, believe it or not. Now, the kids that you're picking, your nieces and nephews, whoever they are, friends, kids, or whatever, they're sometimes, they're a different population in some ways than the ones that we interview. And the dynamics are different. The context is different when you do your interviews. Well, you will find kids who give you an answer, who don't go, I don't really know. Well, try your best. They'll go, yeah, well, it's this. And it isn't that. And some of the questions for that assignment I gave you were like, and that's for a reason. They ask kids to imagine, why, I could ask adults, why do judges wear black robes? Nobody. Who knows that? I don't even know the answer to that. Why don't they wear blue? Who knows? It's probably some tradition that goes back to England or something.
Yeah, we looked it up.
That's the problem with Google. Look everything up. What's the answer?
It was like something with England, and the Americans wanted them to wear. English wanted them to wear the wigs, what they do, and then they wanted them to wear the suits, just black suits, so they compromised, and no wigs, just the robes.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. They wear the powdered wigs in England. Even the lawyers, I think. I don't know if they still do, but they did till very recently. And the judges may wear the powdered wigs. But maybe you're saying instead of the powdered wigs, we'll wear a robe.
They compromised between the wigs and suits, so they came up with just the robes.
Anyway, back to kids and child development. So we want to know as much as we can about how kids develop, and young kids present a lot of different problems. There's research on 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5- and 6-year-olds. Sandra Hewitt divides her young kids into 3 developmental stages. She says if a child is younger than 18 months, they cannot be evaluated for possible sexual abuse. She calls them stage 1 kids. And she means in an interview. Certainly there can be a medical evaluation for sexual abuse. But you can't interview kids less than 18 months. You just can't do it. Now, in my office, we don't interview kids less than 5. Unless there's an exception and there has to be a process that happens in order to interview 3- and 4-year-olds. We do plenty of them, but we start out with the assumption that if they're under 5, we need to know more about the disclosure process in order to do an interview. What Professor Fowler and Sandra Hewitt are saying here is, just as a matter of fact, you can't interview kids under 18 months. They don't have language. They're nonverbal, so they're out. What she calls stage 1 kids. Kids 18 months to age 3, she calls stage 2 kids. And that's really for a clinical environment that requires a very careful process, a behavioral analysis, their status, interview their parents. You need to meet with them many times to evaluate their utterances and behaviors across situations. It's a delicate task. But sometimes you can get information that way about sexual abuse. The thing is, it's not going to be clear-cut. There aren't going to be direct statements of abuse. You need a professional evaluator to look at that and draw conclusions. She calls 3- and 4-year-olds stage 3 children. They have somewhat intelligible speech and sufficiently developed language and concepts so that they can give a basic narrative sometimes. As I said earlier, even preschoolers, and the research has demonstrated this, can have well-organized memories of non-traumatic events. Little kids can remember stuff. Again, the challenge is getting them to express it. Nonverbal memory operates before children are able to disclose verbally. Three and 4-year-olds, what you would call stage 3, they do best with simple instructions like show me, tell me, correct me. And you always want to keep it simple, but they need the simplest sentence structure of all. In this chapter, Professors Fowler and Hewitt talk about how important it is to talk to the caregiver, to get what they call a history. There's a lot of things we want to know from a caregiver in order to do a good interview. And we'll examine them a little more closely later, but you want to find out, what that child's level of functioning is, whether they've had any other traumas in their life, what their relationship is with the suspect, if there is a concern about child abuse or sexual abuse. What's their relationship with the person that we're concerned about? If they said something, how do they feel about that person? What do they know about human sexuality, if anything? What are the words they use about human sexuality? Any past abuse history? What's the caregiver's life like? Are they living from day to day, from apartment to apartment, or is there stability or instability? Before you interview any kid, but certainly a preschooler, you need to learn as much as you can about the environment in which they're growing. And that addresses a little bit of a different issue. When we talk about child development, we're trying to appreciate how capable kids are at various stages of their growth. When I say kids, I mean all kids, generally speaking. Typical kids. When we ask the caregiver about where they live, how the kid feels about the perpetrator, what do they know about human sexuality, and all those kind of questions, those questions are about this kid. So we're setting it up now, right? You see how you're setting it up? You're learning about kids in general, their level of functioning, how they view the world around them, etc. And by talking to people in that child's world, we're learning about this specific child. And I will tell you about the informed versus blind interview later on in this course. But this is the beginnings of what's known as an informed interview. Especially when we ask the caregiver and we learn about this kid, how they're doing in school. So that when you interview that child, you have a lot of information about who's sitting across from you. And you can speak to that person. Anytime you speak, I do a lot of public speaking, you need to know your audience. Who's here? What are their expectations? How much do they know? How much do they know? How much do they not know? You need to know who's sitting across from you so that you can effectively communicate with them. Hewitt and Fowler also make the observation that media may be helpful with young children. They may struggle with anatomical dolls, but they can be helpful in certain cases where kids are able to use them competently. Drawing, markers, crayons, clay. These kinds of props are sometimes used to help kids express themselves. The younger the child, the more structured the interview needs to be. the more simple the questions. Although the legal system demands open-ended questions, no suggesting, no leading, do not ask a child a question that has information in it. These are the mantras of the legal system. Preschoolers don't do well with that kind of inquiry at all. You might as well not even do the interview in some cases. Preschoolers need short, direct questions. That doesn't mean that you can't ask open-ended questions. You should. But they need lots of cueing and focus. What Hewitt and Fowler call it scaffolding. And the analogy is, the metaphor is kind of like building something with scaffolding, like brick by brick or bit by bit. Did you eat anything when you were there? What did you eat? Who went with you? So the first question is mildly suggestive, right? It could be called cued. It doesn't really tell them the answer, and it doesn't say that they ate something. But it's highly focused. Did you eat anything when you were there? It probably should be, did you eat something when you were there? We'll talk about anything versus something later on, but did you eat something when you were there? What did you eat? Who went with you? Now, if they give us information about what they ate and who was there, we didn't suggest that to them. Those things are credible. But again, if you ask these kinds of scaffolding questions, questions that cue the child, you'll do better off than saying, tell me what happened at lunchtime at the zoo, or tell me what happens at lunchtime in the daycare. In all cases, you need information from collateral sources, and that simply means you need to interview a lot of different people, not simply the child, in order to come to a conclusion about what's going on. Any questions or observations about the special considerations for cases involving young children that I just lectured on? Next, Professor Fowler writes a chapter all on her own called Children Who Do Not Want to Disclose. And we're going to focus on this in a little bit more detail later on, but this is a highly problematic part of forensic interviewing. Because if it isn't hard enough to interview a child who may have been sexually abused, because they're young and because they're immature, because they don't have language, because they don't understand us, because they want to please us, because they're scared and nervous. It's hard enough to get information from another person, especially a small child, or any child for that matter. But it is terribly difficult to get information from children who are traumatized by incest or traumatized by someone who they have an otherwise respectful or significant relationship with. Some kids may be competent to tell us what we need to know, but don't want to tell us or can't tell us because of emotions, trauma, loyalty, fear, embarrassment, shame. And that has little to do with they don't have enough language, they're too young, they don't understand words. You know, that child development stuff is one thing. The other side of the coin in these kinds of interviews is are there psychological and emotional obstacles or barriers to disclosure? And Professor Fowler addresses some of that in Chapter 13. And there's some research on why people don't tell. She starts out by talking about studies that involved adults reporting sexual abuse as children. And what she means is there are grown-up, mostly women, but men too, grown-up women, adult women, who tell about being sexually abused as children. And those women were interviewed, and they said, "Did you ever tell when you were a kid?" They looked at adults who report sexual abuse and try to come up with percentages of people who disclosed as a child. And they range from 33% to 92%. The non-disclosure rates among men from 42% to 88%. London, Bruck, Cece, and Schumann in 2005 did a review of adults, and they concluded that the majority of adult victims did not report their sexual abuse during childhood. It's a characteristic of more than half the victims. When I pick a jury in a child sexual abuse prosecution, we ask jurors lots of different questions. And the goal is to pick a bunch of people who don't know anything about the case and nothing about child sexual abuse investigations. You want people who are going to be objective, unemotional, and draw a conclusion based upon what they hear in the courtroom. So that's the goal of juror questioning. And it's almost gotten to the point where I can look at the jurors and when you're picking jurors, there are 14 of them that go sit in the jury box that get questioned. And there's maybe 60 or 70 that sit in the back of the courtroom, in the pews, like church pews. And most counties in New Jersey are very similar. So maybe there's 70 people there and there's 14 there that are actively talking to the court. You know, it's gotten to the point where, well, first of all, you get a fair number of victims among the group. And, you know, I've been doing this for so long, I kind of look in the back and I just think about, I look in the eyes of people, and I've gotten pretty good at determining who I believe is a victim. But what happens is, one of the questions is there something about this case that you don't want to discuss in front of the other jurors that might cause you to be unfair either to the prosecutor or to the defendant? And someone will raise their hand and we'll go back, and sometimes they'll say, well, when I was robbed when I was a kid, but I didn't want to talk about it, or, you know, I got kicked out of school because this happened, and I don't think I would be fair, and I didn't want to tell them I didn't want to say in front of the other jurors that I got kicked out of school. But more likely in a child sexual abuse prosecution is they come in the chambers and the defense lawyer and myself and the defendant, not always, the defendant sometimes sits out in a courtroom and the judge go in there and they say, look, I was molested as a child. And I'd say about 3/4 of them, the judge says, was there an arrest? Oh, no. Was there a prosecution? No. Did you tell someone? No. Well, who did you tell for the first time? You. Okay. And although it feels like kids are disclosing as teens and the investigation by child protection and prosecutions are at all-time highs in matters of child sexual abuse, most kids never tell, and they grow up however they grow up. And this research that Fowler introduces confirms that, and it says to us there's significant percentages of adults who never disclose abuse. Now, that group, London, Bruck, Cece, Schumann, they tend to look at these issues from the other side. They tend to emphasize children's vulnerabilities, children's difficulties in expressing themselves, how they get it wrong. They are more defense-oriented. By defense, I mean they're more likely to be quoted by the defense lawyers. Their research is more likely to be quoted by the defense lawyers because they show how wrong kids can get it sometimes. And you'll see video clips of Stephen Cece at Cornell and a couple other people throughout this course. They said in 2005 that they think that non-disclosure is overstated now, that times have changed. Professionals now ask children about sexual abuse. More kids are telling. They argue that in current samples, most children who do not disclose abuse have not been sexually abused. Now, Fowler says here that, well, if these other experts are arguing now that there's a lot more child assault prevention presentations in school, there's a lot more public awareness, kids are telling more, most kids who say nothing happened. The way to really test that is to look at high certainty cases. And in 2006, after I read this article, I said to myself, I don't believe that times have changed that much. Because my experience demonstrated to me that even when you give people an opportunity and a forum and all of the tools to tell, they don't tell for a variety of reasons. And simply because it's become easier to tell doesn't mean that people tell. And simply because the system is better equipped to respond and be more respectful and more helpful and more professional about women and children who tell doesn't mean that they're telling significantly more. Now, maybe there's more disclosure than ever. I'm sure there is, because there are these opportunities. But there are still significant number of people who remain silent for many years. No matter how much the system of child protection, child welfare, and prosecution embrace them and treat them fairly and respectfully. And that's not the way things went down as recently as 20 years ago. And, one way to do it is look at these high certainty cases. So I said, there's a number of prosecutions that we've done even in Passaic County where the perpetrator video recorded the molest. Why can't we look at it? Because CC would argue, these other experts would argue, well, there's a lot of research out there that says kids don't tell right away. Sometimes they never tell forever. Sometimes when they do tell, they only tell a little bit. All of that research is out there. We've looked at it. And we think times have changed. And we wonder about some of that research. It wasn't done right. Methodologically, it wasn't done correctly. Some of the researchers, an article you might read is, I think I got for you, is Sorensen and Snow. You need to take them with a grain of salt, because a lot of the victims that they included in their study, called How Children Tell, the Process of Disclosure, were their own patients. They also were involved in the satanic ritual cases in California in the 1980s and 90s, which many people believe was overstated or just plain wrong, that these satanic ritual cases were not true. So CC and Bruck and these other researchers who, take the other side and are on the opposite side of prosecution and want to highlight children's inadequacies. They say in 2005, look, maybe kids didn't tell, maybe adults said I never told, but times have changed. And we think the original research was overstated. Because even the research that relied on confessions, you never know if it really happened. Maybe the guy confessed, as many people do, and that's wrong. Look, there are people who confess to things that never happened. There are people that plead guilty to things that they didn't do. But it's not the norm. However, they still say, look, we don't know whether the guy really did it. Some people confess to get 3 years rather than 50 years. We're skeptical of some of these cases. We're skeptical of these cases where the guy confesses. We never know what really happened, they said. And that's what made me think and say, well, I got some cases where I know what really happened because the guy recorded it on video. So Professor Dickinson, who teaches here, and Professor Durso, who teaches here, they're both, well, one's a psychologist in private practice who's an adjunct like me. The other one is a research professor who works here full-time and does research. We took 5 of these cases with 9 kids and a bunch of videos spanning the 9 kids. And I had graduate assistants and interns. We watched the videos. We coded what happened, whether it was fondling or kissing or penetration. And I also had in every one of those 9 kids a forensic interview using the Finding Words Corner House protocol. So we knew what really happened, and we knew what the kids said when they were interviewed. And as I expected, I may have time to go over our little findings there. It's certainly not peer-reviewed research. It doesn't belong in this book, but hey, it is what it is. They were real kids who were really abused, and I had their real forensic interviews, and they didn't say what happened. It was like pulling teeth, as it always is. And it ain't going to change, in my view. And I'm not saying that to be defeatist. I'm saying that because it's just it is a dynamic of incest. It is a dynamic of intrafamilial abuse. It's part of it. If my dad was still alive and he did something bad to me, I wouldn't run to the police. It's my father. If the cops showed up at my house, I would tap dance around what really happened. There'd be 50 other things to think about. He's an old man. What will my mother think? Are they going to take away my house? And I'm 52 years old and a prosecutor of child abuse, and I would be afraid. Right? So that's not going to change. Cece says, kids are talking more. You have professionals going to schools and clinicians ask the first question they ask. You can ask, you can provide forums to tell, and I'm not saying it doesn't have an impact, and they're not good things. We need to do this. And yes, kids are telling at school, kids who are suicidal or wind up at the hospital or in ER or somehow get a mental health evaluation. Among the group of questions is, have you ever, been touched by a person who sexually that you didn't want to touch you? Or however you characterize that inquiry. And they didn't do that before. And if you don't ask, people don't tell. And if you do ask, some people will tell. Oh, the numbers are a little higher, but not that much. So Fowler says we need to look at high certainty cases. And the research I did with Dickinson and Durso, with the 9 kids, they weren't high certainty cases. They were certainty cases. It happened. We saw it. And we interviewed the kids. And they were reluctant to disclose. And they denied large parts of what we saw on video. And maybe, I'm not sure, maybe we can take a look at that later on in class. And I'm sorry, you had an observation right here. Or a question.
Reading these chapters, it made me think about, all through high school I used to watch Law and Order, cold cases. And there was this one interesting case that made me want to read more on Asians and their culture. And this Asian girl would not tell her father that she was raped because it brought disgrace to the family and dishonor and, was part of the culture. So it was a whole town in Chinatown in America, New York City, who had a high rate of Asian girls being trafficked. They were human trafficking Asian girls. And part of it was because they would not go to their families to tell them or go to support or assist them. It had to actually be a rescue mission from the police department in order for them to find out that their children were being raped. And it was kind of interesting because these girls would not tell, even though they had evidence about that they were raped. Medical reports showed that they were raped, and yet they still refused to say that they were raped because it would bring their family dishonor and, and a disgrace. So it was interesting that reading this material, it went back to all the way to Law and Order, and the same thing in cold cases. It was a case about back during civil rights. A lot of African American, a lot of white Caucasian females who were biracial were raped and would not say who they were raped from, despite the evidence, because of the interracial being so prohibited. So it was interesting.
Well, that's a great observation, and you're quite accurate when you express that there are other issues that impact people who've been sexually assaulted, including children's desire to disclose. We're just touching upon the familial aspects. When I say intrafamilial, that means within the family. Intra meaning within, familial, F-A-M-I-L-I-A-L, within the family. I may say intra-household sometimes. Because sometimes there's people who aren't related by family who live in the same house. Many immigrants live with tenants and non-relatives and family friends and uncles, quote unquote. And kids develop bonds and relationships with them. And we're going to look at, and there's a 1-week learning unit on culture. And I'm glad you brought that up. We're going to look at Asians, Middle Easterners, Jewish people, people from South America, and see how their culture might impact the disclosure rates and their desire to disclose. In some cultures, even if you're raped, it's considered a stain that deserves punishment. And I think one of the perspectives I did, I think I put that terrible case. I think they were British citizens and they were Pakistani or something, and they smothered their daughter to death because she was westernized. So we're going to look at culture in detail, but there can be many layers of things that act as a disincentive to talk about sexual abuse, including the Asian culture you talked about and how that impacts it. And if you really think about it, if we get away with, well, it's culture, it's family, it's this and that, the central question that the victim needs to answer is, right? And the answer can be influenced by culture, relationship, family status, where you live, what your mother might think, your brothers, your siblings, your aunts, your uncles, what town you live in, what's going to happen at school. The central question that a victim asks themselves is, how will this be received? What's going to happen? Because we can start with the assumption that they don't want it to happen, right? And this is not a positive. This is not something they typically like or enjoy, although some children do like the attention and they enjoy the physical sensation of it. And they don't, if they're young enough, they don't really feel badly about it. They're being sexualized in an unhealthy way, but the assumption that there's trauma associated with isn't always the case. But in many cases, and those little ones will grow up and then they'll realize they're being exploited and things get even worse then. But the point is, at least with the ones that are a little older, you can go with the assumption they don't want it to go on. They don't like it. It's traumatic in many ways, in some ways, always. But if you want a shorthand for why they don't tell, it's because they ask themselves the question, and they don't actually do this, but if they did, if I told my mom, what would she say? And what would people say? What would happen to me when I told? And if the answer is, I will be embraced and loved and comforted and helped and healed and protected and made safe, they'll tell. Guess what? None of that happens. Not one bit of it. And not because parents and siblings and the system and culture is evil or wrong or bad. It's because these things are hard to wrap your arms around. It's easier to believe it didn't happen. It's easier to believe that the person in your household is trustworthy and honest and good, and that your child is wrong or mistaken or acting out or wanting attention. It's so much easier. You know, and culture is very rigid at times and developed over centuries. And it's hard to shake, and it's hard to reconcile cultural norms with child molestation. You know, and some of these cultural norms may have served cultures very well for centuries. But they don't apply across the board. It may have been in people's interest to keep to minimize promiscuity, to minimize infidelity, years and centuries ago. But you can't apply that to people who've been exploited against their will. So at the end of the day, if you want to figure out who's going to tell and who's not going to tell, you simply need to evaluate how the kid will be received, or the person will be received if they do tell. And more specifically, how they think they'll be received. Because maybe they're wrong. Maybe mom will embrace them and love them and protect them and throw the bum out. Sometimes that happens. The average person I run into that doesn't do this work thinks that would happen in every case. It's the opposite. More often than not, what we call the non-offending caregiver. The spouse of the molester supports the molester, at least in the beginning, and often throughout. And the kid knows that. When they do the math and say, who's going to be believed? What's my brother or sister going to think? How will I be received? When they do the math, they know the answer. And I'll tell you why kids, and I'm jumping ahead of ourselves, why kids who do tell and then take it back, we're going to take a look at that closely in the context of forensic interviewing, recantation. When they do say, well, what's going to happen if I do tell? Well, this is going to happen. All these bad things are going to happen, but it's so bad, I got to get this out. When all those bad things do happen, they're like, I knew it. I need to go back in time to where I was before I told. So they take it back and say they made it all up. And you can't go back in time, but they try. Go ahead.
What happens in a situation where it's like the mother and the boyfriend, and the mother doesn't believe the child? Where does the child go? Like, do they go back home? Are they removed from the situation? Are they subjected to it all over again?
Well, it doesn't even have to be a boyfriend. It could be the husband. Where the mother's partner, in the case of a mother, father, mother partner, mother relationship, and the perpetrator's the male, which is the typical case. The question was, what happens to the kid if they don't believe the child? Well, Child Protective Services comes in, DIFAS comes in, and in next class, there's 24 of them that'll sit here, and they do this kind of stuff every day, unfortunately. And they need to assess the caregiver, the mother in your hypotheticals, ability to protect that child moving forward. Obviously, if they don't believe it, they're a higher risk to not protect, right? So there are basically three outcomes. There's a million in between, but the three basic ones are, I don't believe her. She's a whore. She lies all the time. She smokes cigarettes, and I catch her with boys, and I caught her with marijuana once, and she comes home late. She watches shows on TV I don't approve of. Don't believe her. Bless you. Don't believe her one bit. I don't believe her. Well, we believe her, and we need to move forward with this, and we need to... I don't care. Well, your boyfriend, I'm not... He's staying right where he is. Okay. That child will go to... First option is kin. You want to find a relative that will care for that child and doesn't agree with the mother. So you look for kin, you look for relatives, or you look for friends, you look for someone who has a nexus to that child, a connection to that child, so they're somewhere familiar. And sadly, they got to go. It is as tragic as it gets, because if you're like, well, why doesn't he get out? Well, the child protection can't throw him out. He's accused, but not guilty yet, if ever. Even if he goes out, mom made it clear she doesn't believe the child, and we know all too well as child protection professionals that as soon as we leave, he'll be back in the house, and we can't put a camera in there and monitor it 24/7. Unfortunately, the child's got to move. It's tragic, it's sad, but it's the reality. It's not as often as you think, though, but it does happen. And I'm giving you the worst case scenario, outcome 1. Outcome 2. Well, I caught her with cigarettes and she's boy crazy and I don't know if I should believe her. I don't think I believe her. This can't be. My man is such a good guy and I really don't believe this. But he can go. I'll make sure he doesn't come back because I'll do that. Because they'll say, listen, the first thing they want the kid to stay home, right? So you're trying to figure out a way to get the kid to stay home. Ma'am, you never know. It's certainly possible. I don't believe it. I know, but listen, we're concerned. He's got to go. You have to promise us that he ain't coming back. No, I'll do that. I don't want to put my daughter out. I still love her, and I don't know why she's making this. But yeah, he'll go. He can go live with his brother-in-law, and I will make sure he doesn't come in. How successful that is, who knows? I don't have any data. I'd have to guess at least half of them violate that and let him back in. Because, they pay lip service. Well, I'm gonna. But if they start out with the proposition, I don't believe, yet I'm gonna do what's right for my daughter, it's not going to work out well. But child protection will sometimes, if they're convinced that the mother, the only question is, you don't have to believe it. We'd like it if you do. The question is, are you going to keep your daughter away from him and keep those doors locked so that he's somewhere else and she's here? And if the answer is satisfactorily yes, they'll let the kid stay and him go. Maybe 4 outcomes, because this one she still doesn't. The other one's like, I don't know what to believe. I'm conflicted, but I'll make sure he stays away. That's kind of a variant of I don't believe her, but I'll keep him away. I don't know what to believe, but I'll keep him away. And then there's the one who go, I believe her. I can't believe this, but I believe her. I'll never let him in. I'm going to file for divorce, or I'm going to throw him out, or blah, blah, blah. And in that case, child protection is really happy because, like, all right, this lady's with us. And the guy will go and the kid will stay. But that doesn't mean things can't deteriorate over the next few weeks. There's many a mom who's been very vocal about believing her daughter and keeping him out, and then they go talk to her. Are you sure? Daddy pays the bills, and, I don't have a job, and grandma's going to have to go back to so-and-soville, and, I don't know what we're going to do, but I believe you and I love you. I just don't know what we're going to do. I don't know. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Then they go in the kitchen, get on the phone, they talk to their sister or some other land. I don't know. They're going to shut off the electricity. They're sobbing. The kid's watching TV in the other room. I never said anything to her. Kids are very competent. They're able to express themselves, and they pick up messages and information in a billion different ways, and they know the score. And if you're paying lip service, or you don't really believe in them or trust them or support them, they'll know that in 24 hours. And it'll get worse and worse. And you can tell us all day long that you're cool and you're okay and you love them and you believe them and you embrace them and the bad guy's out and that's the way it's going to be. If you're sending opposite messages in that household, that kid's going to come in within 3 to 6 weeks and take back the accusation. But thankfully, you have progressive prosecutors and child protection workers, and we don't let them take it back. Case goes on. Go ahead.
What's interesting is that in the book, Fowler mentions the example of the studies about the little girl and the little boys who their parents were caught stealing versus a stranger caught stealing, and they said that when they saw their parents, they blamed it on the stranger. But they weren't being coerced or suggested to say that. They just automatically said it. And then something in the discussion board brought that up through the Salem witch trials. That they just were persuaded, or how did Ruth get all these girls to kind of like follow her along with the false allegations? And it's kind of like, I thought that the attachment to the person who is suggested of doing the crime or whatever the case may be is more stronger than what the result might be. So that's how I connected it in the same case.
Yeah, no, there's lots of different motivators for not telling, for falsely accusing someone else, and for protecting. It's a risk-benefit analysis in a lot of ways. If you go back and look at those Salem witch trials, Abigail Paris and those little girls, among the things that happened was there was one of the primary girls' fathers was the town preacher. They all lived a very strict Christian life back then, everybody in that town. But no one had it stricter than the girl who lived in the house with Daddy the preacher man. Yet they were kids, and one of them had a servant named Tituba, who was a Caribbean woman, who was a house servant. And she would tell stories to the kids about stuff that happened. I think she might have been from Barbados or something.
Voodoo.
Well, yeah, she may have been talking about surreal things that happened in her home country, and and regaling the kids with silly stories of her homeland, and that's interesting. And they were having a ball, and one aspect of this whole thing, although not the central reason for the tragedy that occurred, was that they were trying to deflect suspicion from their misdeeds. Right? They got caught doing stuff and going in the woods and goofing around and playing games and doing things they weren't supposed to. So in order to deflect punishment from them, they made false accusations against others. But that's an interesting study there. That speaks to the lengths that kids will go to protect their family too, right? To protect their loved ones. And they had an out there. They had an easy out. They had someone they could accuse. In fact, there's a bunch of studies here. I'm not going to go over them all. You need to read them, though. Some of them include these analog studies where kids were questioned, about touch. This is a very famous study from 1991 where 72 girls, ages 5 and 7, were broken into two groups. Half of whom had their private parts examined, their genitals, their vaginas, and the other half had a scoliosis exam, which has to do, they had their backs checked for curvature of the spine. And they were asked simply about touch. Of the kids who received a private parts exam, which was about 31, 78% of the children failed to mention genital touch, and 89% failed to mention anal touch. They required direct questions using anatomical dolls. The same questions were asked of the children in the scoliosis condition, and 3 of them were false positives. They said that the private parts was part of the exam by the doctor, and that was obviously wrong. So,
With those false positives, though, would that not bring up question marks? Like, if, say, per se, the scoliosis they mentioned about being touched in the private part, I remember how in the beginning of the chapter it said that if you had been abused before, you're more likely to report because you reported it before. So wouldn't that be like a heightened awareness of maybe this kid is being abused and he's speaking out now?
well, I don't know about that. I mean, your statement about kids who've been abused before are more likely to disclose with a second abuse. That's true, and we're going to look at that in a moment. But I don't think in the Goodman study the kids who erroneously reported they were touched on their private parts were talking about some other molest or something. They were getting examined by the doctor. The questions were about whether the doctor who saw you, yesterday or whenever it was, what he did. And among the checking my back, they said he touched my privates. You're going to get false positives, and it's troubling, and we need to minimize them. It doesn't mean we shut down child abuse investigations because there's a very, very, very low percentage of kids who may make a false disclosure. That speaks to we need to find other evidence of it, and we need to evaluate the quality of it. I bet you if we followed up with these 3 children who made a false disclosure, and asked more penetrating questions and more specific questions, we would expose it right away. Not right away, but perhaps eventually. So, simply by getting a false answer and then going away and go, aha, this could happen in real life. Well, it could. That's why we need to be better at it and learn how to reduce, if not eliminate, the potential for false positives. But I think the overriding lesson of the Goodman study is you had a group who had a back exam. Nearly all of them said, no, our private parts weren't touched. Then you had a group who their private parts were definitely touched, and including the vagina and the anus, and 9 out of 10 never mentioned their anus was touched. And almost 8 out of 10 never mentioned their vagina was touched. You had to beat them over the head. You had to hit them directly with a question to get any information out of them about that. And that wasn't a traumatic experience. Now, I'm sure it was an anxiety-filled experience. A genital exam is not fun. But think about it, in the real world. Again, this research suggests that there's a lot of reasons why kids might not tell. Here, in a neutral context, with a person, a doctor, who they have no axe to grind for or against, it could be deduced, at least one interpretation is, the simple inclusion of our private parts might chill disclosure. Forgetting about culture, forgetting about family loyalty and incest and what the siblings might think and what they're going to think of me at school and all that stuff, simply because it involves our private parts, makes it hard to tell. I mean, these are things no one likes to talk about. one of the conferences I've been to throughout the years, the guy would come in and he'd go focus on somebody in the audience and say, "What's your name?" They say, "My name's Joe." "And where do you work, Joe?" "I'm a prosecutor in Passaic County, New Jersey." "Well, how you doing?" "Listen, you see the rest of the people here? There's about 357 people at this conference." "Yeah." "I want you to stand up and tell them about the last time you had sex." "But wait a minute. Tell me where you put your body parts and tell me what your partner did. Go ahead." The point is, we're asking kids to come in and tell a stranger in a forensic interview about sexual acts, which has its own baggage, right? Its own difficulty talking about. Its own inherent aspect of shame and privacy. We're not asking, tell us about the last time you got a triple in baseball, or the little girl, the last time you kicked a soccer goal. We're asking them about their private parts, and when it went in, and how it felt, and were panties on or off. I mean, this is something people don't talk about. In fact, they are socialized to not talk about those things, and to hide those things, and cover those things. Children who do not want to disclose, lots of reasons, they're all in this chapter. Go ahead.
Just what you said, the children at a very young age are already primed not to discuss their private parts.
Yes, that's right.
So now they go in and they're afraid to.
There are studies about the impact of secrecy and calling something a secret. I'm not going to go through them, but Fowler describes them. At page 182, she describes predictors of reporting and not reporting. What's your first name again, young lady? Lourdes. Lourdes said earlier that prior disclosure predicts present disclosure. That is, kids who disclose once are more likely to disclose another time because they know what to expect. And maybe some kids may not disclose because it was a negative experience, as it unfortunately sometimes is. Proximity of the perpetrator-child relationship predicts non-disclosure. The closer the child is to the perpetrator, the less likely to disclose. So daughter against father, less likely. Daughter against milkman, more likely. Right? Caretaker support and disclosure of abuse. The research is very clear here. If your mom makes you feel safe, or your dad, or whoever your caregiver is, you're much more likely to disclose. And you're much more likely to maintain what you said. That is, you're much more likely to not recant or change it or minimize it or run away. The most important thing is caregiver support. And even when you look at survivors of childhood incest, and even when you look at survivors of molestation and rape, some of them do well, and some of them have families and get jobs and they're successes. Not every one of them winds up in an alleyway or in the gutter or worse. Unfortunately, many do live a life of mistrust and negative relationships and failure and anxiety. The number one thing that predicts how a survival of sexual abuse will do in adulthood, the number one predictor of whether they're going to wind up a prostitute, a stripper, a drug addict, suicidal, living in squalor and one negative relationship after another, or doing reasonably well, if not great, is if they have someone that cares about them and supports them. Similarly, when they first tell, it's critical that you have caregiver support. Unfortunately, it isn't there. Most of the time, it's not. You think it would be, but it's not. But it's a factor. Fowler talks about disclosure process. We'll talk more about that later. I think I said that to you last week, that disclosure is not a one-time event. It's a process that kids tell incrementally, a little bit at a time. I think I talked about that in the context of the best way to interview a child is across multiple sessions with a good, competent interviewer. But we don't have that luxury in forensics. But if you think a kid's going to tell you the whole story, I don't care if you're from Harvard or Yale or Stanford or University of Chicago, I don't care where you're from, you're not going to get the whole story because kids don't tell the whole story. At page 183 in Fowler's book, she says, documentation that disclosure is a process. What she means is there's plenty of research out there that confirms the fact that kids don't tell right away, and when they do tell, they tell a little bit, and they build on what they tell over months or years. Disclosure, or the telling of what happened, is a process, not a single-time thing. Many kids delay. We talked about that. Many kids recant. I introduced that. Any questions about Fowler's chapter 13? And children who do not disclose. Very good. Now, the other part of... Oh, look at that. No questions? I was going to go on to something else, but this is a 2-week thing, so we can stop right here. We're well beyond halfway done with this section. Any questions? You want me to go through the Blackboard again? You love that one. All right, I'll see you next week. Do your readings.